All right. I think everybody has joined the room now. I would like to welcome everyone from the German Society, and we are delighted to host this talk today. We would like to thank the panelists for showing up, and we would like to briefly introduce our chair, Professor Alfeld. He's a professor at the Department of Geography and Environment at LSE, and he will moderate the talk today. We're just waiting for our third panelist, Mr. Buch from Vonovia. He had difficulties joining, but he will, I just got a phone call from him, he will join in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to hand over to Mr. Alfeld and wish everyone a nice talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing this wonderful event. I mean, it's a pleasure. It's not the first time I'm involved in one of these events by the German Society. All credit for bringing in the great speakers goes to our students, just like Leo, who you've met. It's my pleasure to welcome you to an interesting and important debate that we're going to have over the next hour. I guess the key question that we're asking is how or whether we need to balance environmental and social sustainability when it comes to real estate and in particular housing. I think it's an incredibly important and topical question, and I'm delighted to have such a fantastic mix of speakers in this panel from policy, practice, and academia. It's not that often that we get such a nice mix on one panel. So with me we have Mrs. Katja Kipping, who's the chairwoman of the Left Party in Germany. I don't think I have to introduce this party. It's one of the mainstream, the big parties in Germany. We hopefully will have soon Mr. Rolf Buch, who is the CEO of Vonovia, which is a blue chip real estate company with hundreds of thousands of housing units in Germany and other European countries. And we have Professor Joachim Schellnhuber, who was the former director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact. As you just learned, I'm a professor here at LSE. I'm an economist. I work reasonably close to the research theme, but although it's going to be a challenge for me, as for most professors, I will try to limit myself to listening and maybe asking questions and not talking too much. And I think with this, we can get the discussion going. I think the plan we have is that our speakers, in the order of Mrs. Kipping, Mr. Buch, should he join, and Professor Schellnhuber, we're just going to have some opening statements from you. Then we can hopefully get on to a kind of multilateral discussion among yourselves. And then eventually we're going to try to save at least about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&As that will come from the audience. Okay, so without further ado, I hand over to you, Ms. Kipping. Please have your say.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And the title for my input is From Sustainability Debates to the Fights for Green New Deal. I'm very delighted to talking about sustainability today. When I was elected to the local parliament in my home city of Dresden around 20 years ago, promoting the idea of sustainability was one of the matters close to my heart. Sustainability back then, that was a term you had to explain at first. In conversation, I always described it as being able to make great progress by viewing environmental and social matters as interlinked and combining these with a different economic policy. I also realized, however, that the term didn't have a mobilizing effect. Social movements used other words such as climate justice. Does it make a sense in the face of a global pandemic to revive the idea of sustainability once again? COVID-19 has turned a great deal upside down. The year with COVID has also shown us that the idea of the market would sort everything is over. It's not the neoliberal belief for more market power that is going to get us out of the crisis.
Okay.
If we want to overcome crisis in a sustainable fashion, we also need to reshape our economic policy. It's now time to commit to economic restructuring, because the route out of the crisis cannot simply lead back to the way things were before COVID, ultimately based on the double exploitation of people and of the environment. It is precisely this focus on profit that makes a society more susceptible to crisis. So it's high time to rewrite the rules. I'd like to illustrate this with two examples from Germany. The way the economic policy of the Conservative Party works is the following. When sectors with a well-established lobby encounter difficulties with sales, the Minister of Economic Affairs is all too happy to help out with a few billion euros, no question asked. This was already wrong before COVID. It would have been far more beneficial to have linked economic assistance with the goal of social and ecological restructuring. This would also have equipped the jobs in those sectors for the future. Of course, employees in various sectors of industry are concerned about the structural change. Of course, the transformation of the energy sector means huge adjustment for coal miners. These fears of loss must be taken seriously. One thing that doesn't help anyone, however, is to feed the illusion that things can continue as before. Instead, it is far more important to provide future-oriented solutions. The COVID crisis had made the failures of the present economic policy especially clear again. In Germany, 9 billion euros issue unconditionally to the airline Lufthansa, but next to nothing for mobile air filters, although these air filters are able to filter out virus-laden aerosols, and those increase protection in schools, bars, or theaters. In other words, billions spent on products and services that are currently not in demand and also have a negative impact on the environment, yet barely any investment in products that are urgently required to enable social life with a higher level of protection against infection. A similar effect can be observed when it comes to the debate over vaccines patents. It was already clear before COVID that patents on life-saving medicine makes it impossible for countries of the global south to gain access to these. As property rights for knowledge, patents mean profits for the pharmaceutical industry. For poorer countries, however, they mean death that could have been avoided. On top of this, we now know that the fight against COVID can only be won through global action. Otherwise, the virus will return to us. So it's not only a moral issue whether poorer countries have access to vaccines. It's also very much in our own interest. We, the Left Party, have a pragmatic proposal, namely that the World Health Organization is put into a position to gain intellectual property rights for medical relevant knowledge in order to make this available to poorer countries, if need be, against the profit interests of the pharmaceutical industry, because the health of the world makes priority over profit. Those were just two examples to make clear how necessary it is to have economic policy for regulating effect. At the start of the COVID crisis, some suggested that environmental matters needed to take a backseat. How wrong they were. We know that the destruction of ecosystems and global warming helped create the condition for a virus to move from animals to human, and thus cause a pandemic. To put it simple, environmental destruction increases the risk of a pandemic. Environmental protection, on the other hand, makes our world more secure against these. All over the world, COVID has intensified existing social inequality. In Germany, we have noticed that people with low wages have lost particularly large share of their income as a result of the crisis. In addition, we now know the immune system of poorer individuals is, on average, not as well equipped to defend them against the virus. In short, the COVID crisis increases the urgency with which we need to diffuse the environmental and social crisis, and to do so in a sustainable way. This calls for the courage to restructure our economic policy. This combined approach to social, environmental, and economic aspects was already part of the debate on sustainability. However, in the interim, this has undergone further development. Social movements and political actors from all over the globe are enthusiastic about the Green New Deal as a comprehensive project for societal change. This has been inspired by the historical experience in the US around 90 years ago under President Roosevelt's New Deal, issued in response to the challenge posed by the Great Depression. As a feminist, it is very important for me to work against the silencing of women in history. In this context, I'm therefore happy to mention that the very social progress created by the New Deal was also thanks to the dedication of women, such as Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet official in the US history. She fought for a stronger welfare state. The Green New Deal concepts nowadays, developed before the COVID crisis, were concerned primarily with solving the environmental and social emergencies. Drawing the necessary conclusion from the shock of COVID has now been added to this. The fight for Green New Deal incorporates the basic ideas of the debates of sustainability, taking a combined approach to social and environmental matters. That is one of the benefits of the idea of sustainability. The Green New Deal takes this and develops it further. It is popular among relevant movements, and with its historical connection to Roosevelt's New Deal, it expresses the necessary historical urgency for restructuring. That is why I am calling for a Green New Deal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kipping. I'm glad to see you here, Mr. Buch. I think just to keep the event rolling, we just hand over to you and have your opening statement, roughly 5 to 10 minutes. That's the idea.
So thank you very much. First of all, apologize. I could see you, but obviously you couldn't see me, so I changed the room. But sorry for this small issue. I will speak a little bit about the different elements of our business. So you know, we are a private company, so we are also have, in our view, shareholders return, but there is more other and probably in the moment more important dimensions of our business, which is social, environmental, and our responsibility for society. Referring a little bit to COVID-19, actually it's not my main topic, but I think we have shown during COVID-19 that the message that we feel responsible for society is not only a small marketing message, but it's also reality. So we were actually, Vonovia was actually out with a letter to our tenants 1 week before the Bundestag has decided the law that nobody should lose his apartment because of COVID-19. So we guaranteed this to the tenants, and you know the law was only limited to 3 months. We are still in this guarantee. So still we guarantee that nobody will lose his apartment because of COVID-19. He probably cannot afford the rents, and we will find a solution. But we also invested a lot in the protection of our employees, which is of course normal because you have to keep in mind that our employees, even in COVID-19, they have to go to an apartment to repair broken water pipes, even if somebody in the apartment is ill with COVID-19. And that's why we have to do everything to protect our people. And we have to protect our tenants. So for example, we started immediately to clean the elevators much earlier on our cost. Much often in our costs than before, because in the beginning, I think we all thought, and I think it's wrong, that COVID-19 was transmitted by touching buttons, which is obviously not the case. So, but yeah, we are doing mistakes as well as anybody else. And we have invested a lot of our capacity to support neighborhoods, to work together with Arbeiterwohlfahrt, with other actually social workers to help the people to actually get compensated the negative effects that they have from COVID-19. In the end, the guiding principle was in the beginning that we have to take fear away from the people, because COVID-19 is actually a threat to everybody. And that's why we thought it is important to reduce the threat. So, but coming now back to my main discussion, we have learned over the last years that earning money is not the only purpose of our company. We have learned that we have to contribute to society because we are a critical product. It's not like a product which can be replaced by something else, or it doesn't matter if you have it or not. It's very fundamental. And that's why I think we as a housing industry has more responsibilities than probably some others. And we have three mega trends which will impact our business and will impact our society. So the first is a mega trend of urbanization. I think there's a lot of reasons why people want to live in cities. I also think that they want to live in cities even after the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, this leads to a structural imbalance between supply and demand in the big cities. So we will have a shortage of housing, especially because we are obviously not able to have enough construction permissions. So this will have an impact of price. And we as Vonovia, we feel responsible. That's why we are not using this imbalance between supply and demand. For example, our asking rent for new rents is 14% below the market average. We have given out a promise to everybody over 70 that even if rent is increasing and the people cannot afford it, then we will guarantee them that they don't lose their apartments. And just one side remark, we also took the last responsibility of the last crisis, which was the refugee crisis, very seriously. We are proud that since 2015, we have given 12,000 people from Syria and Afghanistan a new home. So also here, you can see that we are not only talking, but that we are doing. The next big mega trend is demographic change, very short, but I don't stop talking about it. In 10 years from now, we need 3 million apartments suitable for older people in Germany. We only have 800,000 today. So this will be the next big crisis. And I don't want to be responsible for the fact that people has to move in a nursing home just because we have not done our job. And so that's why we have committed that 1/3 of our apartments, which we are getting back, we are refurbishing for elderly people because we want to make sure that the people don't have to move out of the apartment just because there's, for example, a bath tube and not a ground floor shower, and that's why they have to. But probably the biggest challenge, and I completely agree with Katja Kipping here, the biggest challenge for our society, but also for our industry, will be the environmental change. We are aware of the fact that 1/3 of the greenhouse emissions is related to buildings. So we know that we have to deliver because otherwise society will get a big issue. That's why we as Vonovia committed to binding CO2 reduction paths until 2050. Having said this is very easy for me to commit that our buildings will be CO2 neutral by 2050. This will be the successor of my successor who will be blamed. So that's why we are not only committed to achieve the target by 2050, but we have set targets by year. So we have a 2021 reduction target, a 22 reduction target, a 23 reduction target. So that's why we are giving, and we are publishing this, and we are linking our salaries to the achievement of this target. So this is not greenwashing. This is pure and hard facts. And of course, some of the reductions which we have to provide after 2030, we still have to find technical solutions. But I'm very optimistic that we will do so. But we know now what we have to do. Actually, for new buildings, it's easy. We are committed to build all the new buildings we are building. 85% of this will be 8+ buildings. This is relatively easy. The challenge which we have all together is the existing buildings. Because theoretically, technically, and I'm an engineer, it is easy to get every building on an A+ building, but it's not affordable. It is probably cheaper to build a new building. So that's why we have to find ways. And this is not ways where we have to discuss about politics, it's way how we can manage to do the optimal. And that's why we have analyzed actually all our buildings, and we have invited a lot of stakeholders, including science, but also politicians and tenant association, to think about this problem. And we have published the results in our climate conference in autumn last year. And this was actually the base where we come to our CO2 reduction path. And in the end, we believe that we have to modernize the building as bad as is economically feasible. So this means, yes, new roofs, new windows, new facades, and optimizing. But the last centimeters of isolation is very expensive and very inefficient. So the remaining part, which we cannot do with an optimized modernization, we believe that we have what we need a fuel switch. So, you know, our buildings today are actually still heated with oil or more important and mostly gas heating systems. So we believe that the remaining heat which we need after modernization of the buildings has to be produced CO2 neutral in the quartier. So this means actually that we have to equip all our roofs, everything what we have in space with solar panels. And then we think that we can produce enough solar energy to provide the CO2 emission-free heating. And with this is actually the second element of our CO2 reduction path. So first is modernization, and the second is CO2 heating. And because Katja Kipping is here, we are managing today to have a modernization with this kind of roughly €1.50 per square meter. Yes, it's still for a few tenants too much. And that's why we need a hardship, or we have a hardship case in place where we actually make it possible that even these tenants don't have to move out of apartments. But there is social challenge, yes. But I think there is no alternative to get buildings CO2 neutral, because otherwise the climate change will fail. And then probably the crisis of COVID-19 would only have been a very small crisis in comparison to what happens with the society. And I tell my shareholders, actually you can see in COVID-19, and this should be a wake-up call, that governments rightfully take out of function individual rights, even guaranteed by our constitution. And you know, the real estate industry always thinks the constitutional rights of ownership is the last defense. I don't believe in a crisis that this will be the last defense. And that's why I think we have to deliver the answers to the questions which we will ask in the future. And that's why investing in CO2 neutral buildings is the way to actually make sure that we will survive for the long term. And this is fortunately enough accepted by our shareholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we can hand over to Professor Schellnhuber.
Okay, so let me go ahead immediately. So I'm very glad that I'm on this panel with Katja Kipping and Rolf Buch. I listened with great interest to their initial remarks, and I can easily follow up on that. So I will not talk about the corona crisis, COVID-19. Many things could be said about it when we even do our own research on how much emission reductions are brought about by the corona interventions. Over the year 2020, by the way, it's less than 6%, so it will not save the climate. So just for your information here. Now let me talk about what I call the elephant in the sustainability room. That is the built environment, really. Because when we scientists and climate researchers have thought about the climate equation, I fully agree with Rolf Buch. This is the challenge of our time, really, to stabilize the climate. When we thought about the climate equation, when, of course, we talked about power production, photovoltaics, wind power, and so on, and mobility and insulation and things like that. But we have neglected the biggest of all factors, that is the built environment, so buildings and infrastructures, both operation and construction, of course. And that, if you count it all together, it's more than 40% of the global emissions. I mean, it's mind-boggling in a way, and even worse in a way is that if you look to a country like Germany or UK, when more than 55% of all garbage waste created is from construction and demolition of buildings and infrastructure. So it's the biggest of all factors, but so far urban planners and so on have just thought about, yeah, facades. How could you sort of try to isolate them and heatings and so on? It's all nice and good and important, but I would rather think in a more radical way about it, and I explain a little bit. So what Rolf Buch said is very laudable. So making Vonovia, for example, a giant on the housing market, climate neutral with fixed targets by 2050. I think that's a fantastic achievement. But there is a way to make the built environment even climate negative, and that is what I wanted to talk about a little bit. So again, we have this big crisis, and the important thing is that we really focus on the built environment for saving the planet, if you like. And I really appreciate what Katja Kipping said about the social dimensions here, because the built environment is not only a catastrophe as it is existing now for the environment, it is a social catastrophe as well. And by the way, it's also a cultural catastrophe, because modern age has become to define that arts, for example, culture is for the elites, while the masses, the many, have to do with kitsch, actually. While wherever you come from as a human being, beauty is important for everybody. In the end, style is important for everybody, cultural interactions. And this has created, for example, also the divide, which you both mentioned, between the urban elites and the countryside. And it's no surprise that you have more, even latent fascists, but voters for populist parties in the countryside than in the cities. Why? Because you have this deprivation of culture in the countryside, in the rural hinterland, while every human being is entitled to have access to culture, to social equity, and of course to good environmental standards. And based on all that, I have more or less single-handed started 5-6 years ago a movement, an intellectual discourse in the beginning, called Bauhaus der Erde. So in English, you would call it Bauhaus for the planet, something like that. And you are probably aware that I somehow managed to infect and sort of to convince Ursula von der Leyen, that was announced in September last year, 2020, in the State of the Union speech in Brussels, to create a new European Bauhaus. Now, why Bauhaus? Because it was a holistic approach. The Bauhaus was created by Gropius and colleagues in 1919 in Weimar, and it was meant to use the modern technological means in order to create, sort of good and sort of also fair living space, not just for the few elite people, but for the average people. That was the social sort of challenge in the beginning, and it meant to use everything we know, engineers, architects, designers, artists like Marc Chagall, so world-class artists, and so on, ordinary people. And I think it's now about time, because of the challenges I mentioned, for stabilizing the climate, but I think also for creating social cohesion again, and making culture a people's project, if you like. I think it's time in the 21st century to restart the Bauhaus movement, but now, of course, with completely different aims. As you, Rolf Buch, said, so making carbon neutrality, but even carbon negativity. And that's what I have pursued for a little while. And I give you just one or two examples here. If we would use wood, timber for new constructions, of course, even train stations and so on, as you can already visit in Sweden, but also for renovation, for modernization, because light construction is, of course, superior to using concrete and steel here. When we could store the carbon, which was sucked out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis through the trees, we could store it for centuries, of course. I was born in a wooden house, which was the first public school building in Bavaria, built in 1560. It's a wooden house, and it will still survive another 5 centuries, for example. That's a beautiful house. So we could actually, by using organic materials, we could turn the built environment from a source of emissions into a sink of emissions. And actually, this is not just pie in the sky. We have done the calculations. We could actually remove up to 30% of the existing emissions already now with switching to organic materials. That is one approach. The other one I have mentioned, I think we have to come back to polycentric approaches again. So there is not one big megalopolis like London or Paris or Berlin, whatever, but you have smaller settlements, of course. We have mid-sized settlements, but we are all entitled to be a center for people to live in a good way, with cultural dimensions, with social equity, with access to hospitals and so on. I think this polycentric structure is a treasure in Germany. We do not only have to preserve it, we have to make it even better. And finally, as I said, in the end, it's a cultural question. An architect recently told me we have 3 skins. The first skin is our body skin, which helps us to survive. The second skin is, the things we are wearing, trousers, blouses, whatever, dresses, and so on. But the third skin is the buildings in which we live. And this is so important for our culture. So as long as 2 billion people on this planet are living in shanty towns and slums, for example, and a tiny little elite really is having an apartment in New York City and in London and so on, where we're maybe staying for 2 weeks a year, as long as we have this tremendous social divide, I think our society cannot become stable, nor can the climate, of course. So I was talking for too long, I know, but I was very inspired by my 2 predecessors. So hopefully this is a good start for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, these were really inspiring opening statements. I can assure you that the audience has picked on your speeches. I mean, we have plenty of questions coming in. In an attempt to try to organize maybe the discussion already here around the themes that I see in the Q&A, maybe I could push all 3 of you towards talking a little bit about the tension that might exist between environmental and social sustainability. So I'm referring to a couple of comments that we've been receiving around the rental ceilings that we have in Berlin, and also around the idea of whether rental ceilings or social housing represent right strategies in light of the challenges we are facing in terms of enhancing environmental sustainability. So if I put all of this into one basket and I add what I just learned, that we should be careful not to tear down and rebuild everything because the carbon footprint would be horrible. This means we need to rejuvenate existing housing stock. What Rolf Buch said is that this is actually expensive. This brings up the question, is that actually compatible with the rental ceiling? Can we have redevelopment, sustainable redevelopment of existing housing stock plus rental ceiling? Or do we need to target the social sustainability via social housing? I guess these are kind of themes that come up in the debate, and I would like to address this question to all 3 of you in whatever order you want to answer. So if you
comes to rental ceiling, probably I start. Actually, to be very clear, the German system is, if you are doing an energetic modernization, you can put a part of this investment on top of the regulated rent. And of course, this is what I mentioned. This, even if it's capped today by the law by €2 and €3 maximum per square meter, and we as Vonovia, we made for everybody maximum 2, our average is €1.50. But sometimes the €1.50 is more than the energy saving, what the tenant is saving from consuming less oil or less gas. So it's a burden for the tenant. And that's why it's a social issue, of course, because some tenant can pay for it and some others probably have difficulties to pay. We have now actually a new system which was just introduced in Germany, which was in part of the Green Deal, which actually gives more help for the investment. And legally, the German law says if you are getting help as a company, as a subsidy, then you have to deduct this from the amount which you pass on to the tenant. So technically, with this, actually, the burden for the tenants will be much lower. So that's why I think this is a big help, and this will bring us further. Talking now about the specific rent cap in Berlin, and I don't want to go about the rent cap and the rent freeze, but there's one element in it which in Berlin is actually by law decided that there is a maximum cap for modernization of €1. And today, with the existing regime, you cannot do a fully energetic modernization of a building for €1. It's just technically not feasible. And this led actually, I think, to a side effect, which was not intended by the Berlin government, but to a side effect that all of us has stopped energetic modernization, or were forced to stop energetic modernization in Berlin. And I think there we have to discuss anyway, independent of what the Constitutional Court is deciding later this year. And just coming back, Professor Schellnhuber, you are completely right. This is for us, I would call the second wave. I think we focused on the first wave to get the CO2 reduction on our existing building, because by magnitude, it's much bigger. But we were coming from a different angle, and this is actually how we can reduce the cost of construction. And there we started to think about modular construction. And the first modular house which we built was actually built on wood, because modular construction, wood has, in addition to the CO2 impact, which we haven't seen at this moment, but wood has one advantage: it's not as heavy as solid. And that's why it's easier to transport. So if you are coming to a concept where you're producing buildings actually in a factory more efficient and cheaper, then of course this weight argument is a big argument. And of course, after thinking about, and that's why you can also see politicians helps us, because they are putting pressure on us, they are putting Green Deal, and that's why we saw action, okay, this modular construction, and we will change, and this is a topic for me for the year 21 and 22, that we will actually change to wooden construction as much as we can, because you are completely right. We have to build the buildings that they will live more than 100 years, because otherwise it's a misinvestment. So that's why it is by definition clear that this building will absorb the CO2 for the next century. So I completely agree with you. We still have some issues. Wood is relatively expensive because the CO2 impact is not factored in. And so there is some things where I think we should also get a discount if we are using a CO2 discount or price. If we are binding CO2 forever, it should be reflected in a CO2 payment, reduction payment. This could be a solution, and then it will be definitely also be competitive. Sorry for the answer.
May I jump in directly here? Sorry, ladies first in general, but I think my remarks sort of match directly what Rolf Buch just said, so the first thing I wanted to say is I cannot emphasize enough that the climate now is just on a disastrous road. So we had last year 1.25 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial, while in the Paris Agreement we aim for 1.5. You see, so we are just a tiny little margin away from what most scientists think is not manageable anymore. So this is really a crisis of civilization. And what I just sketched before, using organic material, can be not just timber, you can use other things, then you could actually undo some of the environmental damage. You could, over, say, the next 100 years, remove a lot of carbon again from the atmosphere. So even if we would overshoot, and it's a fascinating scheme, the 2 degrees, for example, by the end of the century, we would be at 2.5 or even 3 degrees. We could come back actually by the right way of construction and purifying again the atmosphere. I think it's maybe a defining idea for the 21st century. Now, for the smaller question of cost competitiveness and so on. Again, I would say, Mr. Buch, you're absolutely right. I have now traveled across all of Europe, actually, and looking at timber constructions and so on. Many companies have invited me. I had talks with people from Vonovia, for example, etc. And it turns out that in a country like Germany, the difference, a timber-based house and a concrete steel house, the cost in the wood-based house is maybe 10 to 15% higher. If you use new prefabrication methodology, maybe even using digital technology, you can bring that down. But on the other hand, 10 to 15%, in Austria, it's almost zero, by the way, is nothing really. If you compare when photovoltaic started 20, 30 years ago, the difference was 900% or something. So if we would come up, say, with an offsetting program, for example, you could compensate flying, for example, by investing into wooden buildings, a hospital, whatever it is, public buildings, private buildings. Or you could have a certificate system where you are honored if you sequester carbon, actually. I think you could easily tip the scales. You could easily move into a regime where organic architecture is by much the better option, even in terms of cost. Finally, yes, with social versus environmental, I think it's a false dichotomy, really. Of course, it is clear if people go to buy organic food, as I do, for example, in Berlin, it is more expensive than if you go to the local supermarket. But what do you get? What do you get if you buy the cheap things is obesity, intoxication, whatever. By the way, you are torturing millions of animals and so on. And you might even create zoonosis like COVID-19 by that. So what I am saying is every human being should be entitled to buy things or to have an accommodation which is in line with nature and the climate. It's almost a question of individual dignity. So I would say we should make available also funding that everybody is able to buy healthy food and everybody is able to actually to live in a climate neutral accommodation. So this is of course a political question. Katja Kipping could say a lot of things about it. So what I'm saying, if you use smart market sort of instruments like offsetting, for example, you could do the job, but also you could have a sort of social reallocation of funds that entitles everybody to live in harmony with nature, actually. I think it's a human right. So there are many ways to do it, but we need to tackle the problem, actually.
I totally agree with Joachim Schellnhuber. Everybody should be able to lead a sustainable life. That is one reason why I'm fighting poverty, because everybody should be able to buy healthy food to live in a sustainable accommodation. There are two remarks I'd like to add to the question. First, my first remark is the following. There are different reasons for rising rents. It's not only the necessary isolation or renovation. an important factor for rising rents is that shareholders want to make profit. Mr. Buch, I really believe you that you do care about the social and ecological challenges, but nevertheless, you have the obligation, being Vonovia, to make a profit. This is written into the basic idea of your company. Nobody could blame you for this, but that is the reason why I am in favor to organize an important question like housing over public or non-profit making hands. That is why I'm in favor that public or urban soils should stay in public hands or in the hands of non-profit making organization. When we speak about ecological change, sometimes one could get the idea that the poor people are the problem, that those people with little money are the obstacle for real environmental protection. But that is wrong. Even if poor people buy the stuff in a supermarket, even if they live in badly isolated apartments, the footprint of the richer, the ecological footprint of rich people is bigger. Even if the rich people go to the biological shops and buy the good, the healthy stuff, even if they buy sustainable clothes for big amounts of money, on average, of course, we always speak about the average. The average, the richer you are, the bigger your footprint is. So if we really want to make progress in an ecological way, we also have to fight the super rich, not meaning the people, but the inequality.
Excellent. Thank you for your replies to this question. I have a couple of other questions that I see here surrounding the theme of urbanization, which also came up in multiple of your statements. So Rolf Buch mentioned that, I mean, urbanization is one of the mega trends they are facing. People have appetite for living in cities. Professor Schellnhuber talked about the idea of having polycentric cities. My takeaway, I mean, from the academic literature is that as a rule of thumb, we can say that if we have denser cities in general, we have cities that are environmentally more friendly because we have shorter commutes, right? I mean, the building stock typically is a little bit more energy efficient, but one downside is that they're going to be more expensive, right? I mean, building density clearly is more expensive, certainly if you go beyond the threshold. So how should we create a human habitat of people in the future with sustainability in terms of social sustainability and environmental sustainability? Do we have something like the ideal city, the ideal size, the ideal density in mind? I mean, I'd really like to pick your brains on that important question.
May I? Or
please go ahead.
Yeah, because I came up with this polycentric thing, and of course there's a long history of what's the ideal city. Maybe Pienza in Tuscany, which I visited recently, which was built by a pope, replacing an old village. It's beautiful. I don't think it's sustainable, by the way. That's a different thing. No, it's a long and academic debate, of course, but I don't think anymore that just densification, like you have in Hong Kong, for example, is the answer to the climate question, really, or to the sustainability question. Because we have so many new technological options, for example, with digitalization, for example, with the corona shock now and so on. I think we are able, in principle, to reinvent the countryside, to reinvent small and mid-sized cities, and nevertheless not give up on standards you are now expecting in Berlin or Frankfurt or Hamburg, things like that. The digitalization alone will completely reshuffle our vision of modernity. Let's face it. I mean, what are we doing today? Under normal circumstances, this event couldn't have happened 50 years ago, impossible. We had pandemics before. much more severe pandemics actually. COVID-19 is nothing compared to the Black Death you had in the 14th century or so on. But now we are sitting here comfortably and have a very good communication. We are dispersed across a huge space, and that is a chance, but it's also a threat. The same is true renewable energy. Renewable energy is the reinvention of the energy system based on local production. Let's face that. Shipping oil across the whole planet, that's the old model. If you have your photovoltaics, Rolf Buch mentioned this, if you have maybe even geothermal power and so on, you can locally produce what you need. And the same is true for food, of course. The same is true for timber. So our approaches to timber-based building is that within a radius of just 50 kilometers from the construction site, you would actually harvest and convert the timber, for example. It's circular economy. Now, everything we talk about, except immediate energy efficiency, short distances, so to speak, everything we talk about, except energy efficiency, is pointing to a polycentric structure, actually. And this was thought before. Last remark on that. Culture is an obsession of mine. I apologize for that, but it's so important for human beings and our happiness. Now, if you look in history, what were the most productive, innovative, and also social, so to speak, cohesive epochs, eras in history? You had polycentric approach in Mesopotamia, then classical antiquity in Greece, the polis, when you had the Tuscany and Umbrian cities in the 15th, 16th century, and even in Germany in the 19th century, Weimar, Jena, and so on. These were small or medium-sized cities, but you had this polycentric system of innovation. And so why not daring have the courage to think about that instead of just making every big city on this planet like London? I lived in London for a while. I'm glad I have left and I made a narrow escape, actually. Talking about the London School of Economics, very appropriately. I much preferred Oxford, actually, later on.
Well, once again, I'm very much in favor of what you said, but maybe we can develop the idea of polycentric cities a little bit more further. But my approach would be, I describe the city of Berlin as a gathering of very different polycentric neighborhoods, because, you know, usually people don't leave their neighborhood. They spend the whole week within their one neighborhood. And
by the way, like Tokyo consists of many villages. Sorry.
Yeah, it's only one city on the paper, but in the everyday's life, it's just a gathering of different neighborhoods or polycentric cities. Well, I'd like to express a hope. Maybe that's wrong, but maybe we can, maybe you share my observation that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and as a result of the digitalization, there is a new attraction of the rural, of the countryside, because now it's more easier for people. It's easier for people to not living in the heart of big cities, but doing the work they really are fond of with the help of digitalization. Of course, that's not an option for all professions, but for some professions, it is already an option. So, and I would say, I was really inspired by School of Architecture, which was developed in the 100 years ago. And as a result of this, there's the city in Brazil, which followed this tradition, but also in a East German town, Hoyerswerda, a town which was built around a coal industry center, but the way the housing were organized is very inspiring, because they said you need all the things people do need in their everyday life must be nearby. Place for cleaning your clothes, a restaurant, a school, a kindergarten, the shops you need, so that you don't need a car, you don't need any means of transport to get to the places you do need over the week. And I would say this end, we also need some green spaces for relaxing and places where people can meet just accidentally. And I would say this is an expectation we should have, no matter whether it is a big city, a polycentric city, or more the countryside. The places people do need during a week should be accessible, even if you don't have a car.
So can I probably add, and I think I was the one was talking about urbanization. Of course, but for me also the polycentric approach in Germany is I would call urbanization. So what we actually see is that the people are moving in these smaller centers. We have actually 30 areas in Germany which are structurally growing. And I think this is good. We should not go everybody to Berlin or Frankfurt. Or, this doesn't make sense. But in the end, the question is, do the people want to live in this more polycentric world, or do they want to really live on the countryside? So do the people want to live close to Cologne or in the Eifel? And I would say there are so many arguments living close to Cologne or close to Berlin or close to Munich than living in the Eifel. And this is for young people different than for middle-aged people and different for old people. So it probably a little bit takes too long because I think we are running out of time. So that's why, but just, and then the last argument for COVID-19, don't forget that only a small part of our population can do home office. So there's a big part of the population which has to live close to where they have to work because it's physical work. So that's why we should not overestimate. But of course, I have to answer a small remark to Katja Kipping because of this profit or non-profit organization. I think we have a history in Germany, I think it's all about governance. And we have a history in Germany where we have seen actually that a non-profit regime, for example, Neue Heimat in the older West Germany, actually has shown that these regimes have some fragility. And if you look on today's listed companies, for example, Vonovia, since its stock listing in 2013, we never made a positive cash flow out of our rental business. So we invest every year more than we get out of the rent minus the cost we contribute. But the stock market is ready to support it because they believe in the long-term future of nicely renovated buildings. So, of course, the German state could say, yes, we don't want to have this money, which is, by the way, mainly pension money, and we want to finance everything ourselves. And we will find a governance which makes sure that mistakes which we have done in the past will never happen again. And the capital market is a good governance. So, by the way, this is proven it's a good governance. And in the end, the cost of capital, it's just a question of the cost of capital. So we are paying a dividend of 3%. So this is not massive. Of course, in the long-term environment of low interest rates, 3% sounds a lot. But this is a 30-year perspective. We will not pay more than 3% dividend also in 30 years because business model just do not allow us to pay more. So that's why I think this is a wrong debate. Yes, you are paying a dividend, but this dividend is actually paid by efficiency gains, which we are having. If you compare Vonovia versus a mid-sized municipality-owned company, the difference what we are paying in dividend is less than the efficiency we are generating because of scale, which is actually coming because we have unlimited access to capital. But this is probably a longer debate, Mrs. Kipping, which we probably should have in a different meeting.
Yes, unfortunately, we cannot serve here as more than a catalyst for a broader debate to have had. I mean, I could easily go on with this interesting conversation with you guys for 1 more hour, and I think we have enough material actually from the audience to do so, but unfortunately the deadline for our slot here is non-negotiable. Therefore, we have to come to an end. I can only thank you very much for your interesting speeches and sharing your thoughts. I learned a lot. Thank you to the LSE German Society for hosting it, and thank you to the audience for the excellent questions. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you hopefully soon at a different occasion. Bye-bye.
Sehr gut.